Are we live? Fantastic. Hello, everyone. Thank you for sticking with it after lunch as the temperature is rising here in London. So is the tone of the conversation. We are talking this afternoon about the legacy of sectarianism. The session will explore the impacts of sectarianism, sectarianisation, and desectarianisation. It will examine what approaches are needed to counteract the legacy of sectarianism. We're delighted to be joined by, virtually, I believe, directly behind my head, is Mustafa Menshawy, who is a postdoctoral researcher at SEPAD, who is unfortunately who was remotely today. Professor Staci Strobl, who is in the room here, Assistant Dean and Associate Professor of Criminal Justice at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville, and everyone's favourite SEPAD leader, Simon Mabon. We are our favourite. So I'm the only one. I believe you are. I think sometimes you present Eddie as a sort of co. Oh yeah, of course. But, anyway, sorry. I will hand over to start with Mustafa and then go to Mustafa. Mustafa, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
That's perfect. Thanks so much for the introduction and thanks for inviting me. I'm terribly sorry for not being here in London with you, and I hope just hopefully next time our path would cut across physically as it could be. So it's a very interesting discussion. I'll try to just make my argument as clear as possible, that far away from Durham. The argument is answering a key question or observation. If anyone travels right now to the Middle East and asks an Arab leader, Arab official, why there is a sectarianism, what is the problem with sectarianism in your country? And the first response that would come from that gentleman is there is no sectarianism. What sectarianism? So the key question that you ask, you will get a definitive answer of with a sense of denial completely to the line that there is no sectarianism in our country. So my argument is why this kind of the denial that comes across is leading to my hypothetical statement that sectarianism and desectarianization are two faces of the same coin. So is actually sectarianism and desectarianism, desectarianization, if you like, are completely similar, interdependent, or complementary, as I do argue in my presentation. So why this is argument that I make? Simply, we have to go back to operational definitions. I imagine that was part of the discussion during the day at the conference. What is sectarianism? Very confusing because there are many different definitions that come across of sectarianism, including this kind of attachment of religious sectarianism, where the religious component is the dominant one, and that comes with the justification of the Sunni Shiite feud, as bloody, as historic as it is, well entrenched, as well as the political manifestations of the Saudi-Iranian rivalry that give this feud, that give this historic disagreement that happened almost 1,000 years ago, give it a sort of geopolitical significance in a way due to different reasons, of course, including oil. So the definition that I adopt is what Simon Mabon, I cannot see anyone actually, so if anyone throwing a laugh or a smile, that would be very supportive, but I cannot see anyone. So what Simon Mabon makes the argument is that sectarianism is a process of boundary making and becoming different. I adopt this definition for a number of reasons. It's not necessarily about religion. That means you can include different elements like ethnicity, nationalism, or secularism. Some of them are actually antithesis or antithetical to religion itself, like secularism. And this is what I try to prove in some of my writings as well. So sectarianism is a process of boundary making, becoming different. That means it's not necessarily about religion. And even if we mention religion, it's in this sense a boundary making, a boundary marker, if you like, in the same way that functionalists would use like the Durkheim's the school, Peter Berger, where they argue that religion is a way of becoming different, having this kind of unique selling point from each other. And so I use religion in this kind of secularized meaning, if you like. So if sectarianism is a boundary making, that means actually desectarianization is completely related to sectarianism. Because out of my analysis of political discourse, of the speeches of President Bashar al-Assad since he came to power over the past maybe 20 years or so, and the Kuwaiti Emir Sheikh al-Sabah al-Ahmad al-Sabah, who came to power in 2006 until 2020, I found a kind of a number of key themes in their argument, which I explained in my report published for SEPAD on the website. You can find some kind of brief version of it and a longer one. And the argument that comes across that there are a number of themes that are actually repeated again and again in the speeches of those two leaders. And I might tell you later why I chose the Assad and Sabah, Kuwait and Syria, completely, apparently different cases. So the first theme that comes in their speeches when they speak about sectarianism is that there's no sectarianism in the country because Syria, in the case of Assad, and Kuwait, in the case of al-Sabah, are completely united. There is a full national social unity in the country. And if the country is united, society is fully integrated, that means there is no sectarianism. So the first theme in which to prove the lack of sectarianism in the country is the national unity. If we are united, that means that actually sectarianism is no longer there. The second theme, of course, my argument is actually pushing for evidence that is making the theme is well substantiated. You can find a repetition, frequency, and there's a pattern of action that keeps emerging again and again in this political discourse over 20 years. The second theme, which is related to the first one, is externalization. This means that the leaders are actually pushing forward the argument that sectarianism is an external import. It's not in our country, it's not in our culture or polity. It's actually imposed on us. And actually, once you mention that, you can open the bracket and add different actors. Of course, the first one that comes to my mind and to the mind of the leaders is the Western occupier. They keeps mentioning colonialism as a key factor feeding into creating sectarianism. See what Nader Hashemi is calling the colonial carve-up. You blame the colonizer, and actually there's a kind of literature supporting this argument as well. Osama Makdisi, a prominent scholar, Palestinian American, whose argument is that Lebanon was completely desectarianized until the Western element comes up. They start playing tricks with the Ottoman Empire, who were imposing a sort of harmony in Lebanon or parts of it, until this kind of rivalry between the Ottomans and the Western powers came across. And here you go, the Lebanon gets completely sectarianized, at least in discourse. So another external actor that comes to mind is, as well, you keep thinking of rivals, where the Bashar al-Assad, for example, is blaming the Saudis for the sectarian problem, mentioning Wahhabism or the Salafi argument that comes up. And of course, Iran comes as a key suspect in the case of Kuwait. The Iranians are actually pushing us into a sectarian position, comes the argument of Sheikh al-Sabah, because simply, while you have the Shia element, the Shia question comes in mind, stirring up, inflaming disturbances internally as they are. So the two elements come together, the two themes of internal unity or internalized unity, if you like, and externalization to add the legitimation element as well. That means actually the two elements, the two themes are actually geared up towards actually legitimizing the status quo position in one way or another. So why actually the two themes actually, which can be coalesced or actually get together under this desectarianization discourse or rhetoric, are actually sectarianizing in a way. The key first element is actually they hide and falsify, challenge any mention of sectarianism. I just came from a trip to Kuwait where I spent a week of research up there, and thanks to SEPAD for financing and sponsoring my trip. And the key question that I ask to any official about sectarianism comes with this, that actually there's no sectarianism. So literally, there is no chance of debating, discussing any sectarian acts, because if there is a certain element which is completely denied, that means actually any element that build up on this denial are completely falsified. How can you actually run the conversation? I remember I had a chat for literally 5 minutes with an MP who is loyal to the government, because I asked him about sectarianism and he says, no sectarianism. Ask him about the Shia question. No, there is no problem. We're completely in harmony. Conversation, khalas, finished in literally 5 minutes after a whole journey of 40 minutes in Kuwait. So you can see the contradiction that comes across in my anecdotal evidence here. So you hide and prevent or preempt any discussion about sectarianism, and this is in itself sectarianizing. The second element is actually using this kind of denial in order to name and shame and antagonize your opponents, especially the case in Syria, when key tactic, which is followed by the Assad regime, is accusing its opponents of being anti-Alawi. So actually the anti-Alawism, that means actually they are in trouble legally and socially as well. They are sectarianizing. So any mention of that, you hit the duck with one stone, two birds. You get rid of your opponents, political opponents, and at the same time, you prevent any discussion of sectarianism. So yeah, and so the whole point is what comes across is that it happened with Michel Kilo, the famous Syrian political activist, ended up in prison for this accusation of raising up the Alawi question as well. So you can hear this different elements. I'm being asked to wrap up, so I will actually do my best to do that in 20 seconds. So my argument is Hegelian in a sense, a bit Saussurian in the structural sense, that we need to discuss sectarianism and desectarianizations as oppositions, not contradictory items that mean they are related to each other. Secondly, we need to think of the uses and functions of desectarianization, how it can be used in a sectarianizing elements. So actually, this is important, policy-oriented. So we shouldn't ask those leaders, as dictatorial as they are, to desectarianize. We are asking them actually to act differently than actually the desectarianization process. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions on that. Thank you so much.
much, Mustafa, and yeah, there's a lot of really important stuff there. But as with ever, I know everyone in this room has so much to say, and it's difficult to marshal it down into 6-7 minutes. So we'll give as I said to Staci, we'll give you up to 10, but I will have to try and be a bit strict so we can get through this. But Staci.
Okay, great. Well, thank you to SEPAD and the Foreign Policy Center for inviting me here. I'm so excited to see everybody in person after the COVID. Well, COVID's not over necessarily. Let's hope it's close. I'm going to be talking today a little bit about historical privilege, historical trauma, sectarianism in Bahrain. As many of you know, I'm the All Bahrain All the Time channel, so apologies if you've heard some of this before. But I've been reflecting a lot because of the coverage of the war in Ukraine. I've been reflecting a lot on why Ukrainian war-torn people are so humanized in the eyes of the West. So it's really starting to think about the contemporary Western audience. I have thrown my lot in with the activist scholars. You know, you can criticize or hit, you know, whatever, but I've decided that I do want to make some kind of difference, you know, with my scholarship. So I just throw that out there. But I'm thinking about the Western audience, particularly the US and the UK. Why is it that when it comes to the level of foreign policymakers, we just lose what I can see is really happening in critical scholarship? People in this room, if folks would really go and take that information and that interpretation to heart, things would be much, much better off. But in my country at the moment, there's this strategic ambiguity where the Department of Defense constantly congratulates the Bahraini royal family and the security apparatus and throws tons of money at them. And then the Department of State releases a scathing human rights report. And it just stands. That's how we operate vis-a-vis Bahrain. And the UK has its own version of that as well. And so what I'm trying to ask myself is, you know, how can the plight of marginalized groups in Bahrain be better humanized? You know, I'm sort of a victim of my own scholarship in the sense that I'm really tired that this being weaponized in this country against marginalized people based on sect identity, based on indigenous ethnic identities. Why is this not sort of resonating in the West in any way? I don't think it's just because Bahrain is a small country that some people haven't heard of. The foreign policy people either don't understand or they choose to not care. I don't know which it is, but I do think that values should matter. And certainly we're not living up to, in the West, the values that we have. We continue to support the regime. I take a historical sociological approach. So I'm looking at sectarianism over the longue durée. I've tried other approaches. I still think that this sort of historical context and following the thread in a very sort of on the ground way is the best way to go. But from that, I'm recognizing that there are these operant dichotomies. It's super complex on one level when you really talk to people or really look at records and documentation. But on the other hand, there are these operant dichotomies, right? Not to reduce it to a binary, but it does matter whether you're Sunni or Shia as to what your life force will be, and I'm going to get to that. It does matter whether you have a tribal pedigree or not. It does matter whether you were more or less indigenous to the island. And I'm not talking about the expatriates. I'm talking about many of the Sunni Bahrainis who are just not indigenous, right? Although they might posture as such. I'm talking about a history of the Bahraini people, for example, being enslaved, their land being stolen, them being packed into villages that are essentially ghettoized, the Ajam village, the Shia villages, the Harna villages. And then, of course, the security apparatus that goes in. And so one way I was thinking of how to tell this story to a Western audience a little better is to focus on historical trauma and historical privilege, that may be the way. I want to re-embody the people through my scholarship, if I can, obviously with the help of people who are positioned better than I am. And you'll see why my positionality is going to be a real problem should I try to undertake such a thing. Historical trauma is a complex and collective trauma experienced over time across generations. The literature has it distinct from intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma is more about, the same thing happens over generations, which we have in the Bahrain case. But in historical trauma is about the structure that makes certain sort of violence and repression more likely over the life course because of the structure. And as a historical sociologist who loves the work of Sewell, I tend to look at key events as establishing sort of the social structure and also the symbolics around it. And so I'm also looking at Galtung quite a bit these days because Simon has pointed me to that a bit. And I'm really talking here about we need to take a closer look at the cultural violence under this triangular model and say to ourselves, well, you know, we can see sectarianism if we look a little bit beneath the iceberg. We need to look at the narratives. We need to look at how people talk in intimate groups, about other groups, and then labels across groups in order to sort of understand how sectarianism is manifesting and why it is, as I mentioned before, why it is sticky. I take issues with books like Omar al-Shahab's Contested Modernity. He says that sectarianism starts with British. It doesn't. It starts with the Al Khalifa occupation. That's the first key event. It's the first settler colonialism. The second is when the British come in and do the full administrative takeover in the late 1920s. Those are the key events that I point to that set up the structure that we're dealing with today, and also the legitimation of that structure. For cultural violence is what people say, that people are marginalized, that they're kept out of certain jobs, that they are taken in by the state for their political activity. I've been following really closely the work of Ali al-Jamri, a British Bahraini poet between two islands. He's been doing some translations of Shia nursery rhymes and other sort of folk stories in many of these ghettoized villages. And he's come across one, I'm going to run out of time soon, but so I'm not going to go into it. It's essentially a nice little cadenced rhyme that tells you that a young lady went out to sell her family's yogurt into the souk, and she was kidnapped either by a foreign person or more probably by a sheikh. And by definition, so this is a Shia community, a Baharna community that was passing around this song. And the enemy to their young women is the sheikh, who by definition is Sunni, and connected at this time. This comes out of we're thinking 19th, a little unclear, but 19th century. It's the ruling Sunni folks that are literally fucking out. And we know that somebody like Sheikh Abdullah, the brother of Emir Hamid, who was inaugurated in the 1920s or 1930s, depending on when you classify it. We know that that brother, Sheikh Abdullah, was indeed doing that. He was kidnapping young women, raping them, and some maybe murdering him, maybe not. People were disappearing at his hands. So there's stuff, that kind of historical memory in that rhyme, if you think about Ring Around the Rosie, Pocket Full of Posy, folklorists sort of say, oh, are we teaching folks how to get through the Black Plague or the Plague of 1665? I mean, this is the kind of place where you're going to see the everyday sectarianism. Because it's not just instrumental. It can be weaponized, it often is weaponized in these regions, but there are these other things that are lurking below that really tell a more realistic story about how people interact with each other and what may spark them to jump into something that is potentially violent. And so by looking at that historical trauma being structured into this sort of ghettoized community and being collectively seen as the enemy to the state, which is authoritarian, we then can look at equally the historical privilege. So how do Sunni loyalists and other loyalists, of course, these are not completely homogenous groups, but how do they talk about the majoritarian underclass? How do they experience their privilege and what is their life course like? And so you've been hearing me talk a lot about life course. So I'm a criminologist by training. When we look at victimology, we're really concerned about repeat victimizations. The best predictor of victimization is past victimization, right? And so people are definitely structured into these vulnerabilities. And I'm going to argue that that's the case here. I want to get into, certainly with cooperation with other scholars, looking at some of these more pop cultural or sort of nursery rhyme or song narratives, to sort of piece together something that may predate sort of the starting point that we usually have for sectarianism, because I believe it is there, but we could debate that. In terms of the historical privilege, when you look at big propaganda by the Al Khalifa, pictures, portraits of the king and his entourage, if you will, I want to get into sort of this notion of, you know, what are the folks that are in the elite? What do they see in that picture? You know, is it Sunni like me or like us? And we can debate whether people see it individually or communitarian. I won't get into that, but Sunni like me, Sunni like us, rich like me, rich like us, right? What's happening there? Why are they standing there? Is it just tradition? Is it just material benefit? Is it something else? And so this is where I think into these sort of narrative spaces is where I would hope some of these studies of sectarianism, at least in Bahrain, would go. So what is the strategy? I'm often accused of just problematizing and walking away. And I love to do that. But I really want to start to highlight, take a look at some of the pop cultural responses. And I actually was thinking, you know, we need, in terms of sort of how human rights organizations talk about Bahrain in the Western media, you know, they're not telling these stories. It's still too extractive. It's still this torturous event, which is so terrible, right? It happened here and there, and the legal ramifications, and that's terribly unfair, which it totally is. But when we see the image in the news of the young man throwing the stone or the Molotov cocktail, what if we start with the beginning of that person's life towards the end? Because there's a village to prison pipeline. We need to start looking at it that way. And the only way without official data to really do that is to start looking at historical narrative, is to start looking at, you know, things that are more often associated with the humanities, to sort of pick out the sort of symbolic legitimizations and also the symbolic struggles that ordinary people are having. And so in terms of the Western audience, this is going to sound a little out there, but I would love somebody to give someone money to do a really great true crime podcast on Bahrain, right? Everybody wants to look at true crime stuff. We have a great story of injustice. We have state violence. We have state murders. You know, maybe it's not exactly a whodunit because we sort of know who did it. Sorry, this is getting really inflammatory. But you know, we can use genres in the West that people love to consume. It would change things a lot more than what seems to be at a stalemate, which is yet another really well done report. I mean, people should be paying attention to our scholarship. People should be paying attention to our reports, but I fear that we just keep doubling down in the US and the UK on a sort of blissful ignorance and or we don't really care, we can get away with this. And so here's some more money.
Well, thanks very much, Cecile. I'm sure there are some people in this network who would be very keen to appear on said true crime podcast.
Show them, yeah.
But you're absolutely right. It's finding different ways. That also, I think it's also connecting the role of the West, whether that's the US and UK, in that true crime, and it's showing that the ongoing link is the thing that will connect beyond those well-written reports that can speak to the same audiences. Hand over to Simon, and apologies that I'm going to go in less than 10 minutes duties of my other job call, but I will, Simon will share.
Sure. Thanks, everyone. And just to echo what you were saying, Staci, it's really great to be doing this in person after 2.5 years of a lifetime of Zoom calls every week. It's really good to be sitting next to you in the flesh. So it's great. I'm sort of a stand-in in this panel, so I'm going to echo some of the points that Staci has made about Bahrain, but I think they speak to many other contexts across the Gulf and across the wider Middle East. So what I'm going to try and do is just tease out some of the ideas with regard to the residue of sect-based difference, and the institutionalized residue of sect-based difference in the Bahraini context, but then of course it will also speak to Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi, Iran, many other cases. So this is work that's come out of the Roots project, but also some of the kind stuff as well. And I'll apologize to Ruba and Adil for overlapping with some of my Christmas paper, but I think there's some points of synergy here. And I start with the Bahraini constitution. Chapter 1, Article 1 of the Constitution of Bahrain declares that, quote, "The Kingdom of Bahrain is a fully sovereign, independent Islamic Arab state whose population is part of the Arab nation and whose territory is part of the Great Arab Homeland." From there, Islam is the official religion of Bahrain. Arab and Islamic heritage are to be protected by the state. Islam positioned centrally within the fabric of the state, offering strength to the family unit, which is the basis of society, providing a code of laws and a way of life. So Islam is front and center within the Constitution. There's no reference to different schools of Islamic thought or sects, which is interesting, I think, because what we have here very quickly is the bringing into the very fabric of the Bahraini state and its institutions and the way in which life is ordered is Islam, religion. And yet, closer exploration across the past 100, 200 years, as Staci does in her work, sees a really complex set of issues whereby religion is being used structurally and deliberately as a means of maintaining difference, reproducing difference, as a means through which groups are included and conversely excluded along the grounds of those shared religious identities. So the sort of the historical process supported by the British, yet driven by the Al Khalifa, as Staci was saying, is such that particular groups from certain backgrounds are excluded along the lines of being members of a particular religious and indeed ethnic community. Now, that I think is really important. Going back to the turn of the 20th century and the following decades, we see parallels here with regard to Bahrain and what happens in Iraq. For my last book, I went back over the diaries of Gertrude Bell and found some pretty inflammatory stuff, as one would expect, but a lot of talk about the sort of the insidious nature of the Shia in the south, the Persians in the south, and you can very easily see a parallel there between what Gertrude Bell was saying in the 1920s and what British, American, Saudi, Bahraini officials were saying in the mid-2000s and later on. I was in Manama in 2014, and an elderly Bahraini businessman was chatting with me. We were in the financial harbour, so looking out over the souk, and he sort of gesticulated wildly and said, "Look, the Persians are everywhere." Okay, so there's so much that's wrong with that. But I think that there is the sort of internalization and reproduction of such long-standing processes of inclusion and exclusion, which predate the British and have a really important sort of role in the creation, production, reproduction of lines of inclusion and exclusion. Because within all of that, of course, is a geopolitical sense of suspicion and enmity aimed at the external other, localized, sect-based identities being populated with those sort of broader regional currents and rivalries. And so that's built into the fabric of the Bahraini state, it's built into the fabric of the Iraqi states, it's built into the fabric of the Saudi state. Across the 20th century, this ability to define groups in terms of inclusion and exclusion with that exclusionary process bound up within broader regional and geopolitical components. And I think that's important because it helps to create this us versus them narrative. And that is right at the heart of these mechanisms of control that states like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, formerly Iraq, were relying on as a means of addressing serious communal differences within their population. So let's not forget, the uprisings of 2011 proved to be a serious issue for the Bahrainis through the emergence of a collective movement around the idea of Bahraini, and not Sunni, not Shia, just Bahraini. That ability to transcend communal difference, to create a movement that would appeal across communal lines, was seen to be an existential challenge to the Bahraini state. So that moment of hope, a desectarianized moment, if you will, was an existential challenge to the Bahrainis because of what they were doing to those lines of exclusion and inclusion. But because of the ways in which those lines have been produced, reproduced, and reinforced over the decades previously, the Bahrainis, the Al Khalifa, was able to manipulate them to reassert lines of inclusion and exclusion, predominantly along the narrative that an external actor, Iran, was manipulating those domestic affairs. So this, I think, is important to know because it shows that what happened in 2011 was not just a one-off. It wasn't just one moment of counter-revolutionary action. It was the latest step in a broader counter-revolutionary process that had been honed over decades, led by hardliners in the Al Khalifa, such as the Prime Minister and the King. We look at the 70s onwards, the establishment of emergency laws, the suspension of Parliament, the state security law, the revocation of citizenship, the cultivation of relations with the Saudis after the British leave to get that powerful external backer. All of these things create the sort of counter-revolutionary toolkit that will allow the Al Khalifa to stay in charge. And it's predicated on that ability to create lines of inclusion and exclusion honed over time. Now, it's worth stressing that this was predominantly directed at Shia groups because of the nature of regional politics and the Bahraini demographics at this point. But as the regional landscape starts to shift, and as the Al Khalifa have really secured their rule in the face of perceived threat from Shia groups, so they've decimated Al-Wafaq, they've decimated Al-Wad, they've essentially stripped out, hollowed out any form of Shia civil society or political engagement, pushing them to London and various other places. The focus shifts to Sunni Islamists and starts to focus on groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, which is emblematic of a broader shift from the Saudis and the Emiratis targeting the Ikhwan and other Sunni Islamist groups. So again, you see these lines of inclusion and exclusion shifting as a consequence of the sort of the broader geopolitical contours of the time. But that is produced and reinforced through the decades previously. And I guess it's authoritarian learning, right? And it's the ways in which sovereign power operates as a mechanism of control. Might have got past the first page. But yeah, there's a very careful and very deliberate set of processes that were being employed here. And the parallels between what you do with your work in the 20s and 30s and what we see now are so similar, albeit using different technologies of control, but the very practice of cultivating division is still there. And I think it's important to see that it emerges from this, is empowered through everything that's happened historically. I'll give one example and I'll stop, and that's the example of the Islamic Front for the Liberation of Bahrain, which was set up in the early 1980s as a means of trying to export the Iranian Revolution into Bahrain. Ultimately, it proved unsuccessful, but the legacy of that group and the very existence of it means that whenever there's unrest amongst the Shia populations of Bahrain, the narrative is, well, Iran is behind it because Iran is behind the IFLB in the 1980s. History matters, the residue, and I'll leave it there. So thank you very much. So we've got a bit of time.
Yeah, and we lost our chair, which
We
is
lost our chair.
fine, but now who's the chair?
We'll both be chair.
Okay, and we'll stop them. He can be the chair.
No. We have to give Mustafa permission to speak, so I don't think that leaves him well placed to be chair.
Do we have 10 minutes? Is that okay? Yeah, questions.
Oh, yeah. First of all, I really like this is very it's really fascinating. I'm going to talk with you. Okay. So you mentioned.
If you like Staci's work, when you're asking me the question.
No, because I
Sounds
was
right.
So it's about So you mentioned that Bahrain itself, just identity from the reality, right? The way we talked about it. But to be honest, I slightly disagree on this point. Because I think the preamble talks about Quran, Islam, and all, but there are so many constitutions in the Middle. They mention Islam, but they don't identify themselves as an Islamic republic. So for me, the problem with Bahrain is the fact that the way the constitution was drafted and how the royal family is the one controlling that. And because of the royal family's religion, or let's say sect, this is how the constitution became associated with them, not the other way around, not the constitution itself, because I can think of like Egypt, it's a dimension is that. It's not an Islamic republic, not like Pakistan or other countries. So it's not about that particular article of the it's about the whole constitution. So I would like to know your take on this.
Yeah, I have a response to a really good observation, because it does just say Islam and Muslim and Sharia and this kinds of thing. You have to look at where the legal power is sort of underpinning that. And so when it comes to anything other than personal status stuff, it's going to be a Sunni legal jurist that will look at a process. That's the heritage or the sort of legal history that will be looked at. And so the context of it, absolutely sectarian, but no, you wouldn't see that through the way it's worded. But I think that's really important, and it's where, going back to the Western audience, it's exactly where the Western audience sort of fails, is they go, oh, well, there is an overture to something that's unifying for many of you, so everything is fine here, right? But they don't realize how it's being used and interpreted. And so that would be my response to that.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's a product of a particular time, right? This one was 2002, so you've got a new king on the near, and someone who's wanting to paint a particular picture. And that picture is something that is setting out a state that is run in accordance with a number of different sets of norms and obligations, including broader sort of international norms and obligations of member states of the United Nations. They're trying to position themselves as a quote unquote modern global state at this time, but also one that doesn't do away with all of the sort of informal traditional parts that are found in Islam, that are found in Arabism, that are found in tribalism. So I don't think they are trying to say that they're an Islamic republic at all.
No, I said
No, they don't.
No, but I'm saying that this preamble emphasized that Bahrain hasn't seen religious identity. I say no, actually, religious identity does not come from this preamble. So Bahrain does not claim to have religious identity. That's the preamble. The religious identity or this form, sectarian identity, comes from another part of the constitution, from the fact that it's the Amir or the king that wrote this constitution. I think it was the commission that they belong to the Amir, the person who created this, and because he created that, because of his religion that he's Muslim Sunni, so this is the identity of the constitution, his own identity. I don't know if that makes sense, but for me, because the way this constitution was drafted, it was kind of like not even a contract, it was kind of imposed regardless of the referendum and charter and all. So basically, the identity of Bahrain comes from the identity of the real country. So they are Muslim Sunnis, this is the identity of Bahrain. But the preamble as it is, that line that we just read at the beginning, for me, it's written in many other countries, right? But it does not that they have religious identity as the country. It's kind of like a classic phrase that is used in order just to say, okay, we have Sharia, or Islam is the main one. But that does not give it the Islamic republic status or the religious identity status. I don't know. That makes sense.
Yeah, but there's a lot in between. As how,
Yeah.
I'm more familiar with the penal law than I am the constitution, sorry. But it is Sharia inspired, but it doesn't look very much like it would in Saudi Arabia, right? And the categories of the crimes are very westernized, right? From colonial experience. So there's something in between, for better or worse, because no, I don't think any Bahraini would say that it is a secular, completely secular law, right? And so it's this hybridity, and it's really hard. I mean, and only sort of in operation does that hybridity really sort of come out. It's and so in context is really important. Oh, we have other questions.
Well, it's a question to me, in ways that similar considerations, ruminations you've had. Most of them, when she just come back from Kuwait, had a very unfulfilling interview, but there must have been more than that. So what happened? What are your thoughts about, what you found in your recent trip to Kuwait? Legacy, maybe not legacy.
I do massively apologize. I think there's a bit of echo coming in the sound. If I ask you kindly to repeat the question, please.
What did you find in Kuwait?
I like that question. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's you mean if there's any specific element that you are asking about? I mean, or generally speaking, because I can keep waffling for literally 2 hours on my trip.
So, for example, earlier today I mentioned that if you're a member of the Hadar, being Sunni or Shia is maybe less of a trade-off in a way. That's a different political dynamic than being a Badun and being Shia. So the dynamic of sectarianism or potentiality of sectarianism is different. What did you find in speaking to parliamentarians? The chair of the Human Rights Committee in Kuwait is a Shia. There's a lot to unpack there, it seems to me.
Yeah.
Over to you.
This is a fantastic question. Thank you so much for asking it. It's exactly and it's very topical and timely when it comes to Kuwait, because one key element of Kuwaiti sectarianism is exceptionalism. It's all the time the Kuwaiti officials, parliamentarians, they argue with the proviso that we are exceptionally different and distinctively unique away from our Arab neighbors, the Gulf neighbors, and they specifically target Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. If you ask me, I think that the sectarianism in Kuwait is soft, implicit, tacit, indirect, and it comes with the look good factor in a way, unlike the Bahraini sectarianism or the one in Saudi Arabia. So the first one is actually this sense of exceptionalism that come across. The second element, which is very strikingly interesting, is that the sectarianism is not monodirectional in the case of Kuwait. It's not about the Sunnis being discriminated against. Part of the key argument that among the Kuwaiti Sunnis, they actually suffer from discrimination at the expense of the Shiites. The Shia get more than they deserve. And this is why one key element, every person that I meet in Kuwait, in the Sunni side or the Shia side, they speak about numbers and percentage. Are the Shia 10%, 15%, 20%? And the loyalty that come along with that. So if they are 10%, that means they overrepresented, a sense of exaggeration that comes across. So the sense of the victimization among the Sunni majority is completely different from the monodirectional element that you can hear in a country like Saudi Arabia, for example, where the Shia have this sense while the Sunnis come from a predominant position as such. The third element that comes across is the sense of balance in the Kuwaiti rhetoric. For example, if you ask them about the external rivals, they will never mention one. They keep it ambiguous and vague, like Assad or the Saudis, where they mention Iran frankly and honestly and clearly. In the case of Assad, he mentioned the Saudis, the Turkish that come along. The Kuwaitis will never mention an external power. And it tells you about what the scholars call it vulnerability position. Kuwait is a small fish in a big ocean, if you like, as the expression is being mentioned and again. So there's a triangle of threat: Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. And actually part of the political game is actually maneuvering their way across it. So it's completely different. The external factors keep it vague and ambiguous as the enemy outside without having a specific element that come across as such. Thanks so much for that question. Completely valid and yeah, it makes full sense to me.
Toby and Mabon, can you be super short?
Yeah, I'm going to be super short on the mission. So it's a video Alistair left before Staci started her talk, which is broadly, I paraphrase, either we need to find a war position so policymakers and the population realize what's going on. We've got to convince. I don't think there's a policymaker in DC or down the road in the Foreign Office who are powerfully aware.
Not in DC. I will concede to London, but not
Every
in DC.
inequity that you mentioned,
No.
and they don't care.
Yeah, that may be true for some of them, but some of them in the US don't
And of
even
course,
know.
the glaring example is Israel and Palestine. They know, and they talk about, oh yes, so we'll publish a State Department report, it's well written, and we know we won't push it, won't give it down, but it gives us a little bit of conscience and say, oh, but then we've got finance. So they know, they don't care, and they just go on. So fighting a war position, convincing people that the Kuwait Shia are really, the Bahraini Shia really like the Ukrainians, and we need to love them and send them long range artillery to save them. This is the problem. I think the problem is cynical.
I don't think it does, because I think we just, I see the world very differently now. And we have to entertain people. And I'm willing to entertain people because I care about this. And I do think, I mean, this is just my personal opinion. I do think it matters if we are citizens of countries in the West that we call out our governments for not, that kind of stuff is really, really important. And that is happening.
Yeah, but calling them out for their ignorance and naivety is giving them a break they don't deserve.
Well, I don't say that they're all ignorant and naive. I'm speaking specifically of many of these sort of intern researchers that are tasked to Bahrain and DC who are busy reading, some security studies bullshit that gives some statistics and some number of weapons and the budget, That's what I'm talking about. And again, I think this is sort of the difference of the sort of policy context here and in DC that we might be sort of at cross purposes. But I do think, and I would never have said this, 5 or 10 years ago, I do think that if we want our governments to move, we have to entertain a bunch of other people who pretend to know and certainly care. And that's the strategy in this, crazy hyper internet-y age. And so pick a genre. I mean, we need money to do this. I hope if somebody's a whale out there and can give me money and can produce something that was awesome.
Podcasts.
Then and really tell this story. I mean, I'm almost giving up academia because I'm frustrated with sort of the story not getting out despite all the good work, right? And so I've started to write a novel, and it is a crime mystery, and you have to understand Bahrain to understand how this is all going to fit together, right? And that could go farther. I mean, I'm not that. It won't, but that is
the most interesting thing yet.
But that's we have to entertain a bit if we're wanting to sort of change the sort of social narrative of our own, because the people that make policy are listening to the same stuff that we all do, right? And so if they can get away with not dealing with something, they will. But if there's for a hot second people excited about this Bahrain whatever it is, I bet that would turn the needle a lot more than our reports in this age, because who's doing the legwork, who then talks to their boss, who talks to their boss, are people who are 25 and 30. It's not the 45-year-olds or the 50-year-olds. Those folks are the problem. They're mostly white men. They're stuck in all sorts of sort of traditions and obligations and social milieus that are beyond me. but I know who's actually writing and thinking about Bahrain, and they're young, and they're text-based, and they're internet-based, and they can convince their boss. That person can convince their boss. Is anybody with me?
Yes.
Sorry. Okay.
But I also started thinking about a novel based on Bahrain.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Oh
I
my
started,
gosh.
I started
We can
thinking
get on
about
the
it.
newsstand at the same time, and then it can be like a whole, wave or something.
Well, then I got very, very scared about writing a novel and I stopped.
Well, it's impossible to write a novel if you've been writing academically. My people are indicating things, they're reporting things, they're not crying and exclaiming, they're very lucky, because I just don't know how to write creatively. Anyway.
We need to move on though.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Sorry,
listening.
Sana. Sorry. We're over time, aren't we? So that means we're on to the last panel of the day. Who's up for this? Me. Yep. Again, excellent.
Thanks.
So, thank you, Mustafa.